Hello, welcome to another episode of the Family Renewal Podcast. I am Israel Wayne, and I am grateful we're going to have a discussion about science today, very specifically DNA, with Nathaniel T. Jeanson. And he is a biologist and an author. And one of the books that he has written that has been published by Master Books is a book called Replacing Darwin. Subtitle, The New Origin of Species. And I'll probably give him an opportunity to explain that book and to tell us what that book is about. But his latest book, also published by Master Books, is Traced. This is a fascinating new book. It's called, the subtitle is Human DNA's Big Surprise. And I'm going to start off by saying that actually our author is kind of a big surprise because as even one evolutionary atheist website put it, Dr. Jeanson is an abnormal creationist. And so I wanted to ask you, how is it that you became who you are in this field, having graduated from a branch of University of Wisconsin, and then also graduated from Harvard? How is it? So if I just looked at your bio, I would say this guy is absolutely an atheist evolutionary biologist who would make fun of biblical creationists, and yet you're a young Earth creationist. How is that even possible? Give us a little bit of background as to how this has happened for you.
I'd chalk up that juxtaposition to a number of factors. One being my upbringing to my parents. I was born 1980. We were in Wisconsin at, I'd say, sort of the ground level, the homeschool movement in the 80s. And parents were highly involved in that. It was homeschooled through 8th grade. And we went to, we're using Christian curriculum. We're going to worldview conferences, Canada speaking. I found my notes from 8th grade, I think, sometime back. Amazing. Have you been evolutionized? I think was his opening question. I thought, well, that's a good question. So there's a strong upbringing there. I went to a small Christian high school. There were 3 options in the area. Only one was explicitly young Earth creation. That's the one my parents picked, and would read on the side. All that, I think, played a huge role. That by the time I got to college and lived at home, which I think also was a key factor, lived at home in Wisconsin, going to the University of Wisconsin Parkside. One of the key elements and outcomes of all that strong upbringing in a strong church with a strong creationist foundation was I knew what was coming in the secular classroom. There wasn't really any surprises where, oh, we never covered this. I could ask questions when I thought appropriate without taking too much time away from class. People weren't paying to hear me talk, paying to hear the professor, but none of what I had heard really surprised me. And I feel like a good creationist upbringing teaches you as much evolution as it does creation science. That's, to me, 101 for debating. Not that we're all trained to be debaters, but if you're going to argue against a position, you have to know it better than your opponent does. So most of my opponents then, which classmates, professors and such, I'd say, and to this day you still see this, are unfamiliar with creation science and can't argue against it because they don't know it. Whereas I came in having been brought up under creation science and in evolution, so to speak, because you learn that as part of the creation science curriculum. And when I got there, was able to survive quite well. Another factor I'd say, I guess I alluded to it already, was a very strong church setting wherever I was, whether I was living at home in Wisconsin for my undergraduate or going off to Boston for Harvard. There was still a very strong church context to hold me accountable. Especially in Boston, the church was kind of targeted towards students, and a lot of young men my age are very transparent. And so, what are you struggling with this week, brother? And you confess your sins, and people praying for me as well. So all that plays a huge role, being in the Word. And really, I guess, thirdly, it's the grace of God. I remember at one time in graduate school, was suicidal at one point. And so I feel like I can look back at my life at many points and say, well, how did I survive that? And the only thing I feel like you can say is, well, the grace of God. But for the grace of God, there go I as every other sinner out there. So I'm grateful to that, to be where I am right now, and grateful to have that opportunity in God's good providence to try to bring him glory in the short life I have on earth.
Well, we're certainly grateful for God's grace in your life, and also that you've dedicated your life to not only benefiting humankind through your study in the sciences, but in helping people to understand they don't have to abandon the Christian faith or to check their brains at the door because of a supposed incompatibility with science. And this is one of the things that you talk about in your book, Replacing Darwin. Now, this is really dealing more with animal biology, but give us a little bit of the background of this book, the purpose and intent of the book, and then we'll move into talking more about human DNA as we move forward.
Yeah, I'll start with the title just because that gives away a lot of the book's approach. And it comes from, again, go back to my upbringing in creation science, hearing Duane Gish debate, listening to, reading Henry Morris books, these sorts of things. And I was aware that one of the main arguments against creation science is this idea of testable predictions, which I'll explain in a moment. Or to put it another way, people have probably heard it in this sense, perhaps, creation scientists don't do science, or that we're anti-science. We've often been caricatured as saying, God did it, I believe it, that settles it. And they'll say, well, see, that just stifles debate. That stifles investigation. We'd never investigate anything in this world. We'd not discover new cures for diseases and so forth. So replacing Darwin rather than rebutting Darwin, because the goal of the book was not so much to say, here's where evolution is wrong. There's plenty of that in the book, but here's a full-fledged, full-on scientific alternative that advances our knowledge of the world, that asks questions that future experiments can explore and test and evaluate, the exact thing that the evolutionary community has demanded of us for 40 years. You can look back at quotes from the 1980s. You can look at major court decisions from the 80s. 82, I think, was the Arkansas versus McLean versus Arkansas Board of Education, where they're striking down a law in the state of Arkansas saying you have to teach creation science alongside evolution. They said, nope. One of the reasons being because they say creation science isn't science. It doesn't make predictions. One of my favorite examples is I've got a water bottle in my hand. Of course, gravity, a scientific idea, predicts if I release my grip, it's going to fall. It does. But in theory, if I released my grip and the bottle started to levitate, now we've got a potential falsification of gravity. That's the idea. That's the thing that evolutionists have been looking for. They'll say, okay, you creationists believe God created kinds of creatures. So I'm granting them that they even understand that, because many don't even understand that. They think we believe God created species, individual species, not kinds. They'll say, okay, we understand that you believe new species will form in the last 4,500 years. So predict for us how many new species of butterflies are going to form this year, how many new species of cattle, or you name it. That's what they're looking for from the creation science community. That's what I end up putting in this book. And in terms of its apologetic purpose, I had taped to my monitor pictures of the target audience that I'd hoped to reach. And one of the target audiences, that the demographics was students who default to evolution, haven't heard any different, and think creation science is just religion. And this is designed to engage them. 10 chapters of science, ends with the gospel. It's a book I wish I had when I was a student to hand to my classmates and say, you got to read this. It's really intended as a giveaway. Now, that was part of the challenge because thanks to the hard work of the evolutionary community, we have very little access to such people. We have access to evangelistically minded believers, and we have the ability to send the book to loud atheists. So we marketed, of course, to people who were interested in evangelism. And, I had people come up to me after talks, and one lady said, I'm the secretary for so-and-so, head of the biology department. I'm going to give this book to him. And those sorts of things would just make my day, because it's really exciting. And the other thing we tried to do, of course, was market it to Richard Dawkins and Jerry Coyne and other very well-known prominent atheists, in hopes that they would tell students not to read it, because there's nothing like telling students not to read something, prohibiting making a list of banned books to make them want to read it. Now, of course, they're smarter than that, and they said hardly a peep about it, but that was my hope. So replacing Darwin, what is the actual origin of species of evolution is wrong. That was the goal. There's a second book I had, a sort of a booklet, Replacing Darwin Made Simple, that I wrote more explicitly for church folks, saying, okay, just give me the cliff notes. And then on top of that, that's part one of the book, the cliff notes and how species form. And the second part of the book is, well, how do I engage the person on the street? Or what if my student comes home and they say, I'm an evolutionist now, and I've given up my faith? How would you engage them? What would they have heard in class? And then practical step-by-step, here's how you counter that. Whereas Replacing Darwin doesn't do that as much, because it assumes the reader is already well-versed. They believe it. So of course they know the arguments against creation science, and I just take them on head on without self-reflectively saying, hey, here's what you're going to hear, because I'm assuming the reader says, well, this is what I believe already. So that's the goal of that book. And then its companion, or sort of the Cliff Notes version, Replacing Darwin Made Simple.
So the Human Genome Project is one that's really relatively new in terms of modern science, and the information that we've had in terms of understanding human DNA and what that unlocks for us is something that is still being explored. So you've come out with this book, Traced. In 30 years, you're probably going to have a book that's going to look a lot different than Traced, because you're really on the cutting edge of this. And you're addressing this in a very aggressive way, kind of getting out there on the front lines with it and making some predictions in this book, but also talking about what the evidence is showing us. But because it's so new, obviously we anticipate and expect that 30 years from now, we're going to have a much more complete picture. But one of the things that is a given within our current scientific community is that the human population goes back, let's say, 200,000 years. It varies depending on who you're talking to. And that basically you have, and interestingly, there is a thesis that this goes back to a fairly small pool of common ancestors, not a common ancestor. And you talk about this a little bit with the Mitochondrial Eve concept. Their concept of a common ancestor is not the biblical concept of Adam and Eve as we would understand it, but that it goes back to a fairly small pool of common ancestors. But a very significant difference from a biblical narrative is this understanding that they would have of us coming from the chimpanzee family. And so we come through that line. So even though you attended school, University of Wisconsin and Harvard, you don't buy into that. Can you help me understand why, and why this book is showing evidence that the new DNA technology that we have, and even a lot of these ancestry.com and all of these different programs that people are getting involved in to find their own human background and human history, you're saying that anthropology and DNA science tell a different story than what we're hearing from universities and museums and public school textbooks and so forth. Dive into what got you into doing this.
Yeah, there's three things that come to mind just offhand that from all that you had said there. And the first thing that comes to my mind is just how the whole field of genetics presents new apologetic challenges. It resets many aspects of the creation evolution debate. And I'm thinking of old Earth creationists in particular, and I'll explain that in a moment. So think of how the creation evolution debate was before genetics. We had fossils, we had geology, we had astronomy. And again, thinking of the old Earth creation position, in a sense, being a biologist, you could get away with certain things that you can't get away with now. So you might say as a biologist, okay, I have trouble trying to explain away millions of years in geology. I have trouble trying to explain away millions of years in astronomy. It trips a lot of people up. But I'm very strongly anti-evolution. I just can't accept the fact that I have a chimpanzee in my family tree. Okay. You don't have to say too much specifically about Adam and Eve. There isn't a lot of data you have to reconcile. It's a fairly straightforward way to try to deal with all this. A lot of people, I think, have done it just because, geology and astronomy are complex physics and math. And so it's hard for people to wrap their minds around all that or wade through all that. But biology, it intuitively doesn't make sense. I come from a primate. Well, now genetics presents a whole new discipline, a whole new set of data that you have to wrestle with in developing your position. So genetics obviously records ancestry. We have very specific data now that we have to deal with. It records population sizes, as you alluded to. So this is within probably the last 10 years, the evolutionists and specifically the theistic evolutionary community, those who say God used evolution, have been pressing the case, saying that modern genetic data discount the idea that at any point in our history, there was just two people alive. So therefore, the biblical narrative about God creating just two people, that initial couple being responsible for sin and precipitating the curse because of their sin, all that can't be literally true. I mean, it takes a sledgehammer to what we see in scripture in terms of the gospel. If there's no one man who sins, Romans 5, can one man save? Are there many ways to God? It has huge consequences. So now, let's say you're an old Earth creationist, what are you going to do? You've got to make some sense of the genetic data. Now you've got a whole new question of how many people were in our family tree. To forget the chimpanzee question for a moment, just thinking about humans, what do you do? And then the last thing I think that becomes relevant with this new genetic data set, this new field, is that genetics also records time. So every generation, there are changes that happen in our DNA. And what I'm referring to specifically are copying errors, mutations that occur because we live in a fallen world. So when sperm and egg copy the DNA, there's mistakes that occur. And so you've got all these new elements of biological origins you have to wrestle with now. And I've seen this now played out, for example, with Reasons to Believe. They're still trying to figure out, what do we do with Adam and Eve? What about this population pair thing? Whole new set of challenges. So that's something new that comes to mind, or I should say, this is bigger context, I think, for what we're discussing. Is we've got this new field of science, a whole bunch of new data within the last decade even, that's presented a whole bunch of new challenges and new questions for people to answer. And I feel like it's made the old Earth position, again, I'm saying this as a young Earth creationist, but that much more challenging to adopt. It's not as easy as it used to be. Okay, math and physics, tough to reconcile with young Earth. I'm just going to say old Earth there, but I'm anti-evolution. Well, what do you do with Adam and Eve? What do you do with the timescale? How do you reconcile all this genetic data? You can't just dismiss it. So that's my thought and my challenge for anyone who's considering or has been old Earth creationist. There's a lot of rough terrain as far as I'm concerned ahead. Now, one of the main points of traced, I should say there's several main points of traced. The first thing I want to say is it's not primarily an apologetics book, and that perhaps is a dangerous thing to say, but there's some huge apologetic ramifications that flow from how I'm explaining this. It's primarily a history book. It seeks to answer the question, what is the history of peoples rather than political civilizations? So we learn when ancient Egypt is founded in history class. We learn when ancient Egypt falls at the hands of the Syrians and Persians and Romans and Greeks and such. We learn when Rome is founded in history class. We learn when the Germanic peoples overrun the Western Roman civilization. But we never learn the story of the peoples, who they come from, and then what happens to them after the civilization falls. Or to make it personal, thinking about the Romans, let's say you have an Italian American living in the United States today. Can they legitimately claim the ancient Romans as their ancestors? And there's no way to answer that question aside from meticulous historical documents, which we have so very few, especially for the common people, or with DNA. And of course, DNA being a new field of science, now we can answer that question. That's what this book tries to do. Now, not primarily an apologetics book, but a history book. Now, the fact that it's a history book where you can make sense of the history from our DNA has gigantic apologetic ramifications. First of all, traced is the fulfillment of predictions I made in Replacing Darwin and put in print. So 2017, about 2.5 years ago, 4.5 years ago, coming up in 5 years ago, I said, if the young Earth timescale is true, you should be able to see the stamp of human history all throughout our DNA. So the opposite of this, the evolutionary model, says that human history, if you think of anatomically modern humans, goes back, as you said, hundreds of thousands of years. So in the evolutionary timescale, the history of civilization, Egypt onward, they'd say Egypt started about 5,000 years ago. This is just the tiny tip, the tail end of a very long evolutionary narrative. And if you try to apply that narrative to the genetic data, it goes into the realm of statistical noise, or it's hard to distinguish from statistical noise. So if you're an evolutionist, there's almost no reason to go looking for the history of civilization in our DNA, because we're going to even detect it. It's just this tiny tail end. There's so much other history that transpires before it. And man, it's in the statistical noise. What do you do? Very different than from the young Earth model, which says every pre-flood civilization was wiped out at the flood, and humanity restarts with Noah and his wife and his sons and their wives, 8 people, somewhere in the Middle East, roughly 4,500 years ago. That's my Masoretic text-based chronology. And then all civilization that we talk about, Egypt, Rome, Persia, and so on, all that is post-flood and within this timescale. So you should be able to see all that in our DNA. Give an example. So we learned about Genghis Khan in school, the world's greatest empire from the Pacific into Eastern Europe. We know he invades Eastern Europe in the 1200s AD. You should be able to see at that time East Asian or Mongolian type of DNA coming into Europe. And there's ways you can see this genetically. All these sorts of things you should be able to see in our DNA, and that's basically the point of the book. And so it's, in a sense, even though it's primarily a history book, it's one long apologetic argument for the veracity of the young Earth timescale. I'd say it's one of the strongest arguments in print for the recent origin of humanity. And on top of that, once again, just like Replacing Darwin by its title implies, This book is the fulfillment of predictions. It meets the gold standard of science that evolutionists have demanded for 40 years. This is the thing students will hear in the classroom. They go off to college, they get their evolution textbook, they turn to the last chapter. What do we do with creation science? This is what the evolutionists are going to say. It's not science. It doesn't make testable predictions. And lo and behold, young earth creation scientists do. And these predictions are working. That's what's so wild. I remember talking to a pastor a couple of years ago who was on the fence as it related to the age of the earth. And once he caught on to the fact, oh, wait, creation biologists, creation geneticists are now making predictions, they're making new discoveries about the world. For example, in the book, I talk about how there's been a very dynamic history in the pre-Columbian Americas before Europeans arrived. All this is carving new paths, or maybe recovering history of the world that we've lost, that mainstream science is unable to do. He got excited at that point, saying, okay, wow, this isn't just anti-evolution. This is making, this is pushing the field forward in ways mainstream science can't even do. This is really exciting. So TRACE fulfills testable predictions. It explicitly addresses some of these new complicated questions that we didn't have 50 years ago in the creation evolution debate with Adam and Eve and such. And it hits head on this long-standing argument against creation science. And I should say, perhaps the last thing to say is, it's now a framework for guiding research for the next 50 years forward. One of the things that's come out of this, and we've made a few videos about this, and I've explicitly solicited input from people who've been reading or listening or watching, saying, if you want to participate in future research, because there's lots of ancient history still left to be uncovered in our DNA, you can go to, and here's the website. It's ancestorsingenesis.org. That's our homepage. So you can go to our homepage and you type in /go/trace. So ancestorsingenesis.org/go/traced, which is the title of the book, TRACED. And there's a little portal there where people can enter their name and email and comment saying either, hey, I've taken a genetic test, I want to participate, or how can I participate in the future? There have been probably 350, 400 people who've responded so far. The response has been tremendous. And there's all sorts of questions that are left to be uncovered, which are done within a young earth creation framework. The data is there, it fits. There's multiple lines of evidence that underscore this. And now we can go forward and do research because it's working. And that to me is probably the strongest testimony to the success of the creation science movement. It's working scientifically and we're moving forward. And I've yet to see the evolutionists really encounter this head on.
So again, Traced is a very unique book because this book is not merely a book about science, but it tells us a bit about gaps within our history that we sometimes know about and sometimes we have no information about. But there are times in the past where it appears, and DNA evidence is beginning to show us this, that population density dropped off in certain places and in certain cultures. And we may be able to pinpoint some of the times when these types of things have happened, and be able to understand them perhaps from a historical timeline, which I think is interesting. And then also, there are some surprises that you've been finding in your genetic research that show that people groups are interconnected in ways that we did not expect. Anything you'd like to point out about just what comes to mind about those two situations of, times where populations seem to have fallen off rather dramatically in the past, and or the issue of us being more related in odd ways, like geographically separated people groups that seem to have very similar DNA sequences.
Yeah, so the subtitle of the book is in the singular, Human DNA's Big Surprise. But if you read the book, there's, of course, all sorts of surprises, plural, that come out of this work. And just to back up a moment, I realized I didn't say this earlier. The main tool that the book uses is a type of DNA inherited through the male line. So the Y chromosome is passed on from fathers to sons, determines gender. So men are XY, females are XX, and there's two genders. There's a nice politically incorrect thing to say, but the biology is straightforward. And I've been rather shocked at how many professional scientists just want to abandon straightforward science because of political correctness. It's really crazy. And I follow the Y chromosome for technical reasons. I'd love to follow the female inherited DNA, the mitochondrial DNA, but there's a ton of statistical noise in there that makes detailed historical analysis almost prohibitive. So for reasons unknown, we're sort of stuck with this Y chromosome. And I should add too, the typical DNA test that looks at the DNA you inherit from both parents is great to about 4 or 5 generations back. It's kind of a dirty little secret of the genetic testing companies. You pay $100 and you find out hardly anything more than what you already know from your family tree, because I'm 50% each of my parents genetically. They're 50% each of their parents. So I'm 25% genetically each of my grandparents, 12.5% great grandparents, 6 and 2.5 great grandparents, and below 5%, these tests really aren't that reliable. And you can see it. You just take 2 genetic tests from 2 different companies and you'll get different answers, especially in that category. So that's the Y chromosome. And what we're trying to do then is look at the history that it records. The Y chromosome is inherited. So it tells you who you came from. There's your ancestry component. And as I mentioned earlier, the Y chromosome is copied imperfectly. So every generation, there's new mistakes that are introduced. You can see this easily. Most of our DNA is identical, but there's a few spots where it differs, and you can count that up, quantify it. And so if you compare my DNA to my son's DNA, Y chromosome, you'll find about 3 differences. You compare my son's Y chromosome to my dad's, his grandfather, there should be 3 plus 3, 6 DNA differences, Y chromosome differences. And so in this sense, the Y chromosome acts like a clock that marks the passage of time, the passage of generations. And so the Y chromosome marks ancestry, it marks time. Those 2 elements are the fundamental elements of a traditional family tree. And so DNA fulfills those 2 requirements, and you can use DNA comparisons to reconstruct a family tree. And that's really what the book does, is look at the family tree for humanity and see how history has played out. So anyone who takes a Y chromosome test, and that's really the main type of data that we're looking for, males, can understand their history. So one of the other surprises that comes out of this book is you can trace every single male's ancestry back to specific sons of Noah. That was a surprise actually that came out after an initial draft of the book. I had a draft ready to go at the end of February of 2021, and due to some snafus, had some downtime and did a deeper analysis of the scriptural text in April of 2021. It's sort of a concordance search of the names in Genesis 10 to see what the Bible says. Novel concept. What does the Bible say about the fates of these men? Then lined it up with the Y chromosome data, and boom, it just appeared. Okay, here's Noah, here's Shem, Ham, and Japheth, here's some of their descendants. It all just popped out in a pretty spectacular way, which of course is yet another line of evidence indicating the veracity of the scriptures, its confirmation in the Y chromosome DNA. And there's also another surprise that you alluded to. So every person, every male can trace their ancestry back to specific sons of Noah. We can see the rise and fall of civilizations. You think of the pre-Columbian Americas, as I alluded to earlier. That's where some of the biggest surprises have come up. The traditional mainstream account is the origin of the Native Americans goes back 15,000 years, which is an incomprehensible amount of time. One crossing from Central Asia across the Bering Strait, and then these people lived in solitude, isolated from the rest of the world for about 14,500 years until Columbus arrives. Well, you look at the Y chromosome and all that history gets demolished. There have been multiple settlings of the Americas, multiple crossings, the most recent being probably about 1000 AD. And before that, probably the 300s to 600s. And I go through in the book, this anchors Native American history within the context of old world history that we describe. So the Huns, of course, invade the Roman Empire at the end of, or around the 400s AD, right around the same time. Another Central Asian group, so the Huns are thought to be Central Asian, another Central Asian group crosses into the Americas and probably leads to the downfall of the sort of the American equivalent of the Roman Empire, the Mayans, who had the classic civilization, the pyramid builders. So to me, it adds a whole new element, a whole new perspective on Native American history. And again, these are things that no one in the mainstream community is talking about because they have the wrong timescale for all this. And the 4,500-year timescale, in a sense, really is the hero of this plot because it makes all this history pop out, the history that we know, and then we can use the history that we know we can jump from that point to use the Y chromosome to uncover history that we don't know or that we've lost. Because you look at the Native American history pre-Columbus, pre-Europeans, hardly anything written down. Mainstream community says, what do we do with the oral histories? We don't know what to make sense of it. Delawares actually have a history that finds almost an exact echo in the Y chromosome tree. That's a whole other surprise, is you've got indigenous histories, multiple histories being confirmed in the Y chromosome tree. In a sense, you can give people their histories back. There's missions applications for all this. I remember talking to a Bible translator who said, this is fantastic. And he's, light-skinned like me and you, and going into Papua New Guinea, let's say, and he said, we'll give them the Bible in their language. And what might they say? Well, this is a white man's book, they'll say. he says, now we can argue in general from scripture saying, no, your story begins here too, Tower of Babel, Genesis 10. But with the DNA sequence, we can specifically say, and I can tell you for many New Guineans, they go back specifically to one of the sons of Joktan, who's a descendant of Shem, and can say, no, your story starts right here. These are your ancestors. And again, because many of these indigenous histories are being confirmed in the Y chromosome tree, you've got a natural apologetic inroad saying, okay, and this is what I've been asking people who write in, if you're part of an indigenous group, what is your answer? What is your narrative for who you came from? Because my guess is there's many elements of truth in there that we can find echoed in this Y chromosome tree. And then step 2 is, and then I can tell you exactly who you come from in Genesis 10. Here's the start of your history. So there's all sorts of things that come out of this, surprises from Noah to indigenous histories being confirmed, to being able to confirm personal ancestries back to specific sons of Noah. And again, that portal that we have at answersingenesis.org/go/traced is a way for people to write in and say, hey, I've taken a Y chromosome test. Who do I come from? I do have a table in Trace. The last 4 pages of the color illustrations are a chart of, hey, if this is your Y chromosome test, here's the son of Noah you come from. Here's the history, the complicated, messy history all of us have, the chapter that covers it and such. If you're a lady, and so men aren't the ones with a great advantage. My Y chromosome just tells me one small sliver of my family tree, says nothing about my maternal ancestry. Well, you find a male relative. So we've had my mother's brother have his Y chromosome tested. So there's ways ladies can figure out that side of their family tree as well. So all sorts of things pop out of this. And again, it's just the beginning. There's so much more research to be done going forward. And I'm really excited about where this could end up, not just for history's sake, which I think is great fun, sort of a kid in the candy shop, almost a Indiana Jones and genetics type thing that we can uncover now. And I should point out here, for any parents listening or watching or students, there's so much more to be done. This is such an exciting field to get into, and creationists are at the tip of the spear. Anyone who's interested in this, encourage you to get into this field if you can, because again, this is the beginning, and this will probably last the rest of my life to uncover all the lost peoples of the ancient world and so on. So thinking about careers, this is so much fun for me. And surprise, and there's so many more surprises to uncover. So anyone who's thinking about that, go for it.
I just want to show some of our viewers here, if you're watching the video version of this on YouTube, there's a whole color plat section in here that has lots of charts and graphs, lots of ancient history, maps and places of geography. And of course, in the end, helping us to be able to show the lineage of how we fit, how our Y chromosome can help us to fit into where we descend, even from one of the 3 sons of Noah. It's a fascinating book. It's a quality book. And there's so many implications, as you said, Dr. Jeanson, about how this impacts culture. We already looked at, the fact that we may be able to fill in gaps of history where we can trace migrations of people back to certain time periods where we know that this ethnic group's DNA matches with an ethnic group across the country, and so or across the world, I mean, and so we can identify potentially when they moved there, and then when we see civilizations being replaced, there's a whole lot of narrative that we can begin to fill in with this genetic information. So it has huge implications for history. It also has big implications for an issue that is very prevalent in sociology right now, which is the whole issue of racism, because people are approaching this issue of so-called races from an evolutionary perspective. But what you're talking about, again, kind of turns that paradigm on its head. Not that we have descended from primates and that there are more highly evolved and lesser evolved humans. You're talking about us having common ancestors. What are the implications of this as it relates to the issue of racism?
Yeah, so maybe a good way to segue into this would to describe the structure of the book real fast, because this makes one of the points as it relates to races and racism. The first couple chapters are basically introductory principles to set people up for the shocks that I anticipate they'll find in the subsequent chapters. So dealing with the fact that you and I and anyone watching has a 95% chance of having the same common ancestor just 600 years ago. So, you start to think about that and say, okay, anyone, any ethnicity? Yep, that's what the math says. That's chapters 2 and 3, and then chapter 4. That one goes through just how quickly so-called races can change. So you can have a dark-skinned parent give rise to light-skinned descendants in just a few generations, or light-skinned parents give rise to dark-skinned descendants in just a few generations. And this is what we see played over and over again within the Y chromosome family tree. Or just to summarize that, what this book shows, what the research shows, is that the so-called races have changed multiple times in human history. And think of light-skinned people like me and you're most likely, I don't know your Y chromosome result, but you're most likely to be of Central Asian descent, just based on how you look, and being of perhaps Western European or even Eastern European descent. Most Eastern and Western Europeans have their Y chromosome ancestry in Central Asia just 1,000 years ago. So so I've done my Y chromosome test. I belong to one of the dominant lineages that exists in Western Europe, one that's also in France, Jeanson being a French name, it fit, which was kind of satisfying. But that goes back to people who probably looked much more Chinese than they did look Roman. And there's a dramatic change that's happened. One of my favorite examples, though, is there are light-skinned Scandinavians. It's a small percentage, but there are some light-skinned Scandinavians, pale-faced, who go back maybe 1,000 years, and their ancestors would have been the olive-skinned Arabs who invaded Spain in the Middle Ages. Well, you trace the olive-skinned Arab ancestors back even further into the BC era, and they come from Northeast Africa, probably modern Sudan, where their ancestors would have been very dark-skinned Nubians. And it doesn't stop there either, because you think about Egyptian history, and one of the last dynasties to have ruled before Asians and Europeans conquered them, Assyrians and Romans and such, was the 25th dynasty, or the Nubian dynasty. So there you have dark-skinned Northeast African, Sudanese-like people on the throne of Egypt. So there are some Scandinavians, some people of European descent, maybe even some viewers, watchers, who have Scandinavian ancestry, who might themselves have traced their line back to ancient Egypt, of all places. So, and to go back to a point you had alluded to earlier, that was one of the big shocks for me, to see that one of the answers to the question of what happens to civilizations after they fall is that people become the people of the next civilization. So you got or Egyptians who became Nubians, or were Nubians, who became Arabs, who became Swedes, and of course now you've got, as a result of colonialism in the Americas, became Americans. So there's all sorts of crazy messiness in the tree that dramatically changes how we view race and ethnicity. What is a race if you can't even say it was something stable, if it's changed multiple times in human history? Imagine if every school child grew up learning this, that what we call race is some temporary category and arrangement of features that in a few generations could be gone, and something completely different. And on top of that, how we are all interconnected. Again, 95% chance any two people on the globe have the same common ancestor going back just 600 years. All that takes a sledgehammer to the whole notion of racial superiority, whether it's white supremacy, black supremacy, Asian supremacy, you name it. How can you even talk about such a thing when such concepts completely lose their meaning going back just a few hundred years? So the research in this book has a dramatic impact on that discussion, I think, because of the history it implies and reveals about the so-called ethnicities and how much it's changed all throughout human history.
So you talk about in your book, and you demonstrate scientifically, it's a little bit of a technical argument, how these changes can take place very quickly in just, a half dozen generations in some cases. It doesn't have to be 200 generations for us to have significant changes in our external appearance. So you actually argue in this book that having this, say, 200 years of Homo sapiens history, that's actually problematic from the genetic standpoint, that time is actually not the friend of the evolutionist when it comes to genetics, that actually time becomes a problem for the evolutionist. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yes, and I should say here as well, I'm glad you said that, because now I can explain it. And there isn't a ton of discussion in the book, partly because some of the anti-evolutionary stuff I had put in replacing Darwin. And secondly, just because there is so much positive evidence, there's so much that's working within this young earth framework. We we're just bulldozing forward because it fits. So some of the sequence of events that have led up to where we are now deal with this whole concept of a clock. How fast or slow does DNA change every generation? And if we can measure that, what does that say about the timing of our origins? So this has been done. And one of the main things the book does talk about, I think it's chapter 5, have been the empirical measurements of the rate of change between fathers and sons. So it's a pretty simple experiment. You get some volunteers, father-son pairs, or maybe you get two men who know they have a genealogical ancestor, maybe in the 1800s, because we've got enough records for this to do that in some cases. You get their Y chromosome, sequence their DNA, and then you just simply count the number of differences between them. So how many changes per generation? And the history of these sorts of experiments is fascinating. Truth is stranger than fiction in many cases. Some of the early studies, so there was a study in 2009 published by the mainstream community. Two Chinese men had a common ancestor in the 1800s, measured the amount of Y chromosome differences between them, and concluded, oh, the Y chromosome changes slowly. It's perfectly in line with the idea that humans had a common ancestor, males had a common ancestor going back 200,000 years. Okay, fast forward now to 2015. Another study comes out, this time from Iceland. So it's not a huge population in Iceland. They have fairly extensive genealogical records. And they had, I think, 274 pedigrees of men of known relationships with, and I think the number of men was beyond that, but there's 274 pedigrees. And again, looked at, you get the Y chromosome sequences from the men who volunteered. You look at the number of differences between them, you count them, and you say, okay, how fast or slow does this segment of DNA change per generation? Once again, concluded, seems like it's slow, fits this idea that humans originated 200,000 years ago. Well, both of these studies were of somewhat low quality. It's just where the field was at the time. How much DNA do you actually go through to make sure how do you know that you've actually gotten a real difference or you've missed some differences? Well, the long story short, with low quality DNA sequencing, you miss a lot of differences. So there's a chance then those could have been artifacts in what they called a slow rate of change, because they didn't detect that many differences among these men, could have been misguided. Well, we can answer that question because another study came out in 2015, another one in 2017, two more studies that looked at high quality DNA. So let's go over this DNA thoroughly with a fine tooth comb to make sure we've missed nothing. And lo and behold, it's much faster. The first study, the 2015 one, is fascinating because they put in their supplemental data, the supplemental text to the paper, exactly what they did. And they say, and by the way, this whole study was not as its primary purpose trying to figure out how fast or slow DNA changes. It was just looking at 300 men from around the globe and say, okay, what can we learn about human history or something along those lines. And as a control for their experiment, they said, well, let's look at about 30, 31 genealogically related men, known genealogies related, fathers, sons, or brothers, that sort of thing. And just to make sure our methods are working. And they say in the paper, we measured and we counted the number of differences between fathers and sons and these related men, and found a rate of change that was 10 times faster than what we expected, 10 times faster than the predictions of evolution. And they say they created a new filter for the data. They literally filtered out data that was contrary to their expectations. You can't make this up. They put in print saying, we found a result inconsistent with evolution, and so we got rid of the data that didn't make sense. It's wild stuff. And the second paper was equally wild, perhaps by its silence more than what they put in print. In this case, they had these were Danish families, 50 of them, father, mother, and then an offspring. So in some cases, it was a daughter, and I think in 17 of the cases, it was a son. So you've got 17 there, father-son pairs, where you can look at the Y chromosome rate. Well, this study was explicitly designed to measure the rate at which DNA changes every generation. They've got meticulous, thorough experiments, getting the DNA from dad, DNA from mom, and again, not just the Y chromosome, the entirety of the DNA, and very detailed methods, detailed results, and exactly how fast or slow the DNA changes. Does dad pass on more mutations than mom? All that stuff in the paper. Missing from the paper was a statement about the Y chromosome mutation rate. They have a section where they talk about chunks of DNA that change, because that happens too. Weird things happen in DNA. There's whole chunks that might mutate between fathers and sons. Well, what they never talk about is the single letter changes, the stuff that really matters for our purposes. And so it was the great silence that I found rather fascinating. One step further, though, they did put a tree in the paper with a scale bar where you can, in a sense, extract the raw data, from their results that they apparently didn't want to talk about, and find out exactly what the mutation rate was, which once again is far too fast for evolution, perfectly in line with young Earth creation. So that's just one example of the DNA that's come out when using low quality methods seem to fit evolution. Then so this is all in the mainstream literature. Then the mainstream community does high quality studies. They get a result that doesn't match. Either they say we literally filtered it out, or there's this conspicuous silence. And if you are clever enough, you can find a way to extract the data that seems to fit. Now, just as a follow-up, because this is now making its rounds on the internet, one of my critics has said, well, I emailed the authors, and they said, what you did was misguided, because what you're calling mutations is actually sequencing errors. There's always some sort of error rate in these sorts of measurements. It's sequencing errors. I just had to chuckle. I thought, this is perfect. I mean, this is a perfect illustration of where we are at now in creation science versus where we were. You think about where we were, and the evolutionists love to characterize us as anti-science and holding to this religious book, and we can't change it, and we're over here just trying to do science and make discoveries about the world. Well, now the creationists are saying, let's do science. I've put testable predictions in print. I've put some of these predictions to the test and seeing if it actually works. And it's the evolutionists saying, no, let's adjudicate this issue through private emails, and he said, she said. So again, what would be the simplest way to resolve any sort of potential conflict? Publish the data. So these authors didn't do it in the first place. And then secondly, instead of just emailing this guy, they could have published it again. So he's trying to say, well, he said so. And then of course, when pressed on, someone had said, well, why don't you just share the entirety of the email with us? Oh, no, I wouldn't share my private correspondence. He's still hiding stuff. Now, I can say with confidence whether or not those are sequencing errors based on the predictions that such things make. We've already tested the predictions that flow from this rate of change, and they're working. You can find Noah, you can find the echo of human history, population rises and falls. Again, a lot of these things are in the book Traced. So of course he never deals with that sort of thing. So I'm saying, hey, you've got a claim, let's go test it. And no, we're going to keep it behind the scenes, hidden in private emails. We're not going to show data. This is where we are now, which I think is perfect. It's now the creationists who are asking for science. And it's the evolutionists saying, no, there are certain dogmas we can't question, which is about as wild as I can think of. It's a complete reversal of roles, which I think is, again, a testimony to the maturity of the young Earth creation science movement. It's a watershed moment of this debate.
I just want to go back. I want to back all the way back up to the beginning of the interview. And I just want to reconfirm something here. So let me see if I understand this correctly. So you graduated from the University of Wisconsin, and then you later got a Ph.D. from Harvard in biology. You actually believe in a literal Adam and Eve who lived about 6,000 years ago, and you believe in a literal global flood that happened 4,500 years ago with Noah and his wife and their 3 sons and their wives. And then you believe in a literal Tower of Babel where people groups began to disperse around the world because God confused the languages and separated people, and they began to separate out as people group. You believe that all of that fits within the information that we're actually getting from DNA sequencing. Am I understanding you correctly with that?
Those are all things I hold to, and the mainstream science community has long viewed that as a liability, a disadvantage to making new discoveries about the world. And to me, what this book Traced shows is this was a key framework to uncovering new things about the world. It's not a liability, it's an asset. It's an advantage, a leg up I have on the whole rest of the community to uncover the history of humanity, the history of the globe. So yes, a strongly affirmative yes, and also want to affirm that this is actually one of the key planks going forward to doing real science and to making discoveries and not having to sweep things under the rug that are inconvenient. Yes.
So also, just again, for clarity, you touched on this, but when people are wanting to participate in the kind of research that you're doing, what is helpful at this point, given the technology that we have, is not merely for them to just get a standard genetic test through an ancestry website, but rather they need to ask specifically for a Y chromosome test that's going to come through and trace the lineage of the males. And why is that important?
Yes, and just to elaborate on a little bit based on the number of people who've written in, if you do, let's say, a standard ancestry.com test, those all appear to be just the DNA from both parents, not the male inherited Y chromosome. Family tree DNA does have standalone tests that you can pay for of varying detail, $100 to I think several $100 for that very highly detailed test. What I found from the people who've written in as perhaps the best bang for the buck, so to speak, and this is not necessarily an endorsement, but this is what people have written in, and this seems to be the best quality you can get. 23andMe has a basic test. It tests all of your DNA, it appears, your female inherited mitochondrial DNA. So I have my mitochondrial DNA from my mom. Males and men and women have it, but only moms pass it on, it seems. It tests your DNA from both parents, and it also tests your Y chromosome, all part of one package. And it does so in a very detailed way so that you can line it up with some of the details I show in the book. And that's one thing I've been disappointed with family tree DNA. I've used them for some of my relatives, and the basic test doesn't get you very far. Okay, basically this kind of major section of the tree, fine. But the family tree DNA, excuse me, the 23andMe will give you a very specific haplogroup, branch report. And that's the type of data we're collecting at this point, phase 1. And once we've collected a certain amount of data, we'll say, okay, what do we have in terms of number of people in this branch versus this branch? What are the key questions we want to answer? How much will it cost? All those sorts of things get factored in going forward. One of the perhaps most useful things. So there is that, hey, if you take a Y chromosome test, and are you willing to share the results? Or do you plan on doing so? And will you share the results? Secondly, if you belong to an indigenous group or perhaps a minority group, there's a lot of history there to be uncovered. And it's so, for better or for worse, much of recent human history, much of the genetics from recent history is that of the winners. And some of the most interesting ancient history is now in the minority lineages, minority groups. And so if you belong to a minority group, my guess is there's going to be a lot in your DNA that'll give us some key clues to some of the open questions of ancient history. And that'll be going forward. So it's, again, the website is answersingenesis.org/go/traced. I also have that website in the book. If you get a copy of it, Appendix A, because that's where you get a lot of the supplemental data as well. If you're a nerd, you want to find out all the primary data behind it. But that's some of the major things going forward. Also, I've made an appeal to missionaries. So if you're working with maybe you're doing Bible translation, and I've gotten a few folks write in saying, yep, we're doing this, and it'd be great to be able to figure out their specific connection to men in Genesis 10, so we can give that to them as well, give them the scriptures, and also give them their explicit genealogical ancestry back to those sorts of sons as well. So there's all sorts of possibilities. I've left it somewhat open-ended, and I've had all sorts of responses, but in terms of the research, those are the main things we're looking for going forward.
Let me ask you this, a little bit of a curveball question, but why do you think it is that we're so fascinated with our ancestry? I think people want to know where they came from. I think everyone that I've ever met who was adopted wanted to go back and find their family history, their biological family history. And why do you think that pull or that drive is there for us to feel attached to something and to feel connected to something? First question. And then second question, going back to the biblical narrative, how reassuring is it to us in a sense that we didn't just evolve as accidents and come up through hundreds of thousands of years of evolution and primates and so forth to be, the accidental misfits that we logically are, if that theory is true? How reassuring is it that we actually belong to a family that's made in the image of God? Can you touch on what's the pull or draw for us in finding those connections, and then how does that tie back to the fact that we're part of one family?
Yeah, to your first question, in terms of, I guess, me speculating on the psychology of the why is there such an appeal? Perhaps my first nerdy answer is there's mystery, and I love mysteries, and trying to solve and delve into the unknown is fascinating for me. I guess thinking of my own personal story, so my mother's German, and I don't know that I'd thought and reflected a lot about who we came from. Maybe I just assumed, well, Germanics, I guess we have some connection back there, but how do you figure it out? I mean, hardly any written records in terms of genealogies and such. My dad had done some work, but got back to maybe great grandparents, and then it kind of goes dark. So what do you do? And to be able to have a tool to say, oh, now there's this whole new window into the past that I can access, that's exciting. But my guess is probably the biggest factor just has to do with human identity. Who am I? And we often go to history for that definition and trying to make sense of value and such. And I'd say it's probably true for individuals. It's true for whole groupings. I'm thinking of a negative example in communist China. I'm told the communist Chinese are trying to make all minority groups Han Chinese, suppressing their identity. So probably somewhat for political purposes. If you, and really it's not unique to the Chinese. You think, thinking back just a few centuries prior to them, Genghis Khan was clever when he would conquer another ethnic group. He would deliberately take all the men he captured who were, not killed and perhaps surrendered so they could become part of his army, and would break them up into separate sections of his armies so that there would, to break up their ethnic cohesion. Also think of one example too, having been to Germany and to concentration camps. My wife and I, for our honeymoon, so she'll say this is one of her favorite examples, sounds morbid. One of the favorite things she saw on our honeymoon trip to Germany was the concentration camp, Dachau. And not that it was great pleasure in it, but there's so many sobering, life transforming lessons that you gain walking through this ground where so many people were slaughtered, and then have to explain to you. And one of the things she often brings up is the tour guide explaining one of the first rooms you walk into where people were checked in to the concentration camp. He said, think about what makes you you. Is it your hair color? Is it how you look? So he waits for the audience that he's talking to think about it. He says, it's your name. And one of the first things they did when you got to Dachau was to strip you of your name and give you a number, to completely dehumanize you. So I think there's all that, to me, seems to play into this who am I question. What is my identity? Who do I come from? Is it something to be proud of? Is it something to be ashamed of? What defines me? We think of our, I guess we implicitly think of our name that way. And genealogy is, in a sense, the inheritance of your name. And of course, there's all sorts of surprises that may show up. I think of my own family tree when we were testing my one of the relatives, males, he's got the family name, but we found out from the family tree, not from the Y chromosome, but there's an out of wedlock birth, and so took the mom's name. So we're not actually testing the family name. We're testing this dad or grandfather or great grandfather would have back here because of that. So there's all of that, I think, plays a role in who am I? And here's this tool to try to figure out more of that. So there's this mystery, but there's also basic human identity. And
the Bible answers that quite differently than evolutionary biology.
Yeah. And so to your second question, perhaps thinking about it personally, a lot of my day is playing the devil's advocate, because I have to be my own worst critic. How do I know that what I'm actually saying is true? How do we know that this data makes sense? Or what do we do with this seemingly piece of contrary evidence? And so you're constantly asking questions. And on occasion, then I have to take off the scientist hat and say, okay, we've discovered this. What does this mean? And perhaps one of the, I don't know if it'd be a sense of relief or refreshing or reassuring elements of all this, if I just sit down and think about what's all going on, is to be able to say, okay, I don't know if saying makes the Bible more real be appropriate, but to have this sort of organic connection. Okay, mine is my haplogroup, my branch R1b. It's a bunch of letters and numbers that'll make more sense in the context of the book. They aren't necessarily pretty, but this is what the scientific community has done. Can say, okay, came from Central Asians about 1,000 years ago. They were in Central Asia for thousands of years, perhaps connected to the ancient Scythians. These are the sorts of stories you can unravel with DNA. And they go back to a specific son of Joktan, along with Native Americans and New Guineans and Chinese and that sort of thing, probably. Or the Chinese may go back to Joktan himself, back to Shem, and be able to say, okay, reading Genesis 10, there's my ancestor. He connects to me, which of course you can have that without genetics. But I guess to be able to sit there and look at the Y chromosome family tree and trace all that and say, that is my relative. It puts a whole new, I hate to use the word feeling on it, but it makes that connection organic. I guess I feel like it's probably like going to the land of Israel and to be able to walk and say, okay, I'm walking where Jesus literally walked. I'm where the nation of Israel literally was. And to be able to see all this, it's, you kind of sit back and say, wow, this is amazing. And it, for lack of a better term, makes it all the more real then. You hate to say you doubted it. The Bible expects us to take the word at God at his word. And we do.
Yeah.
And then I guess to be able to have this window into the past and say, wow, this is how it all played out. That's amazing.
We also theologically have a grid or an expectation for why we see some of the things that we do. And you go back to Adam and Eve, and you have a sin issue, you have a global flood that is very connected to a sin issue. You have the Tower of Babel, which is connected to a sin issue. And then the story of human DNA and genetics, it really ties into this idea of mutations and copying mistakes. And that's really how we learn so much about our history, is through these copying mistakes. And, points, you use this illustration of a clock that you can go back and see in history, how there's these time points where you had shifts based on copying mistakes and so forth. Well, we have a theological or philosophical understanding for that you really don't get within a Darwinian framework. And so, really this book has implications, although that's not the intent perhaps of why you wrote the book, but it really has implications related to the gospel too, because not only, when we study, can we learn our history, but we learn that we all come from a common origin. And so we can't merely say that the Germans who committed atrocities during World War II and Dachau and Auschwitz and so forth were just evil people. But we see commonality that we tie in genetically and historically with a whole humanity of sinners. And so from a where are we going standpoint, eschatologically and everything else, in terms of the end of times and all of that, it really shows us that there's a sin problem, and what do we do with that, right? So that kind of ties back into how the biblical worldview differs from the evolutionary worldview, because it seems to me like Darwinian expectations are very humanistic, that we're all just going to get better and better, and that we're going to solve all of our problems through science. And yet, I don't want to get too far. I'm throwing a lot of things out here, but like one of the things that genetics can do is it can recognize, with some of these mitochondrial issues and so forth, things within our DNA that we might be able to fix. And so there's this hopeful expectation that we may be able to solve some of these things, maybe even prenatally. But if we don't have the ethics to know how to process that properly, if we don't start with the right biblical worldview glasses, we could create all kinds of problems. And so really, from a biblical framework, if we don't understand that humans innately all have common ancestry, and that we have a common sin problem that plays out in racism, a sin problem that's played out even in our biological genetic defects, a sin problem that exists, in terms of our economic and social issues and all of that, it really does point back to the gospel. And for us to even do good science moving forward with all the potential that DNA has, the biblical worldview really differs from the evolutionary one, doesn't it?
Yes, and as you were chatting, something else that came to my mind in terms of we like to other the evils of the world. It's them. One of the things that comes out specifically from this research is, again, 95% chance you and I have the same common ancestor 600 years ago.
It's amazing.
Same thing for me and Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Barack Obama, whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, any person you like or dislike, you probably have a relative with them in the recent past. There's no escaping it. I think about my German ancestry, and I'd probably implicitly downplay any sort of connection to Nazis, but there's going to be some connection there. And really, maybe I'm saying this perhaps in self-defense, but the facts are what the facts are. Any Caucasian American, European American, you go back a few hundred years and ethnicities basically disappear. Nations disappear. So I don't have to be the only one who has to confess I'm probably related to some sort of Nazi back in the day. Many of us are, and to some degree or another. And that's another element too, is all of it's there and we're all interconnected, and it's hard to escape that connectedness to what we'd rather create a separate category for evil, not me, but no, we're organic related to all this. And yes, you look at the progress, so to speak, of DNA change over time, and it's not progress, it's a ticking time bomb. even the evolutionists will talk about how the mutations in our DNA are leading towards genetic catastrophe. Seems like it's going too fast for the human species to survive, which of course is sad, but there's also a silver lining of mercy. I mean, look at Genesis 3 itself theologically. God kicking them out of the Garden of Eden is a judgment, but it's also mercy. How, living forever in a garden apart from God, never having a chance to fellowship with him again, would be horrific. And so for God to curse them and make a day of their death is judgment. But because we know the rest of the story, where he then sends a savior and gives a promise, of course, in Genesis 3:15 of a coming savior, someone who will crush the serpent, which we know is fulfilled in Christ. There's also the hope of redemption, so that death then becomes the gateway to restored fellowship with God after having trusted in Christ in this life. And then death becomes the gateway to have that fellowship restored. Of course, we get a foretaste of that with the Holy Spirit coming in and dwelling us, and be able to enjoy fellowship with him again and have our sins forgiven, a clean conscience, and no longer have to hide from him like Adam and Eve did. So these genetic clocks echo that dual judgment and mercy. Judgment, we're becoming more corrupt and degraded over time, but this is also has an element of hope, because for those who've trusted Christ, there is that foretaste, there is that death becomes the means of regaining the fellowship and joy and paradise that we once had in the perfect state pre-sin, in which we lost with Adam and Eve's sin, in which we, of course, underscore day in and day out with our own sins. So there is that illustration of these fundamental truths of Christianity, even in the genetic realm.
Well, the book is called Traced. The author is Nathaniel Jeanson. The publisher is Master Books. And I'm going to recommend this for parents. Parents, you ought to read this. High school students, especially those who are desiring a career in the sciences, should really pick up a copy of this. I have a 21-year-old son, my oldest, who works in the medical field, and he saw this book and picked it up and looked through it and said, I'd like to read this. This looks really fascinating. And so this is a book that's going to help you, particularly if you're interested in your own genealogy, your own ancestry. It's going to help you to be able to trace back specifically where's your lineage tied, and maybe even go all the way back to a specific son of Noah, if you can imagine that. But also in terms of studying ancient history, this is going to be helpful for you. Again, you as a parent will have to probably read this, but then take the information that you gain in terms of the people groups that you're studying in ancient history, and you'll be able to see through modern genetic research how it confirms how these different people groups are more tied together, and are tied together in ways that we didn't expect. Fascinating book, so much here, so many more aspects and nuances and facets of this that we wouldn't have time to get into even if we were here all day. An amazing, fascinating book. It's called Traced. It's available from masterbooks.com and really anywhere that they sell Christian books. Also, I would recommend Dr. Jeanson has videos that you can access through answersingenesis.org. Some of them are available through AIG's YouTube channel. You can check those out. And Dr. Jeanson, how are some ways that people can connect with you? You mentioned already the way that they can help contribute to the research, but what are some good ways for them to be able to stay connected with you and the work that you do there with Answers in Genesis?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is that website again, that portal for connecting, with me, because I go straight to my email. Mm-hmm. It's answersingenesis.org/go/traced. And I had a couple of people saying, hey, please put me on the subscription list, email list for updates. I don't have it yet, but I've got enough people where I put in a request to the IT team saying, how do I do this? I need to keep people updated on what's going on. So that's probably the best way going forward. Avoids as many social media censorship as we can directly to the email. But if you are on social media, I am on Facebook. I've got Nathaniel Jeanson page. I've got a page for Traced. I've got a page for Replacing Darwin. I've tried to also establish an online presence on any other social media platform. It's more, who knows who's going to get banned, who knows who's going to get censored. So I'm just going to sign up for all of them and see which one succeeds.
There you go.
In hopes of having some sort of connection. So on Gab, on Getter, on Parler, and MeWe, and I'm trying to think about Telegram. And I'm trying to think here if there's a good way to see all those. I've tried to keep a consistent Nathaniel Jeanson, but Getter didn't have enough characters. So I'm Nathan Jeanson in Getter, but I think it's, if you watch some of the videos, I list all the specific ones if you want it in detail, but pretty much all those social media platforms you can find me. And again, the portal, if you enter your contact info and email, it goes directly to my email. I can respond to you that way. And hopefully will also be a way to generate a subscription list for all those who want to say, just keep me abreast of what you're doing, the research projects, need for volunteers, or updates on what's going on, new discoveries. That's what I'm hoping I'll be able to do in the near future.
And then if there's a church or a conference that's interested in having you come and lecture, speak, or do a seminar, is that something that you're open to doing?
I have done primarily webinars over the past couple of years. And so we've done virtual.
Okay.
I haven't done too many in person, but I think if you go to the events page, that's the sort of discussion that can happen there as well.
Absolutely. Well, we're grateful for your work. I think you're going to be a great encouragement to a lot of our families, especially those who are currently homeschooling their students or have them in a Christian school, and they're thinking, we're putting in all this time, we're putting in all this effort, we are exposing our children to a biblical worldview, but we know the statistics of those who go to university and crash and burn. And you've laid out some good parameters to say that there's a number of things. You living at home was helpful. You being plugged into a local church during your college years was helpful. You having extensive apologetics training before you went to college. But I think it'll be encouraging to hear, for them to hear your story, that you're someone who succeeded in a very hostile academic environment as a Christian, who went there with their biblical worldview glasses on, and now you're involved in top scientific research that is making predictions that are coming true based on real, observable, testable, repeatable science. And so these are great things that I think are going to be a great encouragement. So thank you, Dr. Jeanson, for being willing to come on and be a guest here on the Family Renewal Podcast.
Thank you, Israel.
All right, God bless.